Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As folks get logged in for the webinar, I'm going to go ahead and just share some general housekeeping announcements. You are going to be muted during today's presentation. So if you would like to ask a question, we ask you to use that Q&A box. Questions entered into that Q&A feature do help us keep better track of questions versus those that are entered into the chat. So if you could help us out and put them in the Q&A, that would be much appreciated. And we'll save those for the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. And this presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health and California Labor Lab YouTube page. And all participants who logged in today with their registration email for the full live presentation will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form, and that'll qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once you've completed the evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Ed Yellen.
Thanks, Michelle. And it's a distinct pleasure to host Dr. Boris from UC Santa Barbara. She is going to give the final talk in, I think, what's been a fantastic series with occupational health physician and medical historian Paul Blanc, talking about how present occupational health problems are really an extension of the ones that he studies as a historian, occupational health physician, followed by Annie McClanahan, who's professor of English at UC Irvine, who studies the rhetoric underlying gig work, an important thing to understand if we're going to do something about the adverse impacts of it. Our own Carissa Harris-Adamson, who talked about home office ergonomics. But today we turn our attention to the home as a workplace with Dr. Boris, who's a distinguished historian and feminist studies professor, in fact, whole professor of feminist studies at UC Santa Barbara, and has written several really important volumes on women's work. To list a few of them: Home to Work, Motherhood, and the Politics of Industrial Homework in the United States, Workers, Home Healthcare Workers in the Shadow of the Welfare State, and Making the Woman Worker, Precarious Labor in the Fight for Global Standards, most recently, I think published just 2 or 3 years ago. Excellent, important work. So we're really honored to have her. I just want to take a second as well to say that with the conclusion of this series, we are going to be moving to a series on making work healthy. And the first talk in that will be given by Dr. Gloria Sorensen from Harvard's Total Worker Health Center and School of Public Health there. She will be followed by Jenny Weisbord from the Family and Workers Organization, who've done some major studies in this area. So I do not want to delay because we're all eager to hear what Dr. Boris has to say. So welcome, Eileen, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Well, thank you very much, Ed, and thank you, Michelle, for all your labors. And I'm going to, let's see, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Hi again, sorry about that. It should be working.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to share this and okay, I'm sharing my screen and let me begin the slideshow. Well, I am really pleased to be here. I'm a interdisciplinary historian and feminist theorist who believes that both capitalism and our gendered arrangements are too important not to do historical and contemporary research on. And I like to joke, I have 2 topics, home and work, and they're really the same. So let me begin, because I hope I can leave enough time for questions. I want to begin with a couple of headlines. from the last few years. Mothers are the shock absorbers of our society. Pandemic imperils promotions for women in academia. Women are not okay. Headlines such as these highlight the impact of remote learning and working on the health, welfare, and work life of those who disproportionately still care for dependents across the generations. Cisgendered women, whether or not in heteronormative households, tending to children, elders, and others who require aid in undertaking the labor of daily renewal. Those who must combine earning and caring in the same space, among those who have borne the brunt of COVID times, when increasingly numbers of people worldwide have moved home to work, estimated as 557 million workers, or 17.4% of countable labor force, according to a recent International Labor Organization data. Today, I want to think about the home as a workplace in two interlocked registries. First, the outsourcing of income-generating work to domestic dwellings, what we traditionally have named home-based or industrial homework, performed in the past mostly by mothers and children, though with the digital revolution, increasingly by men. And these images are to evoke the garment industry and the kind of digitally based remote work that we're all increasingly familiar with. But also, I want to look at income earning on the part of workers who go into other people's homes, that is, by domestic and household workers of all sorts. And so I have a cleaner in COVID times as this other image. As the Tanzanian trade unionist Vicky Kenyoka claimed before the 2010 International Labor Conference of the ILO, and I'll be talking about some ILO standards later, domestic workers are, and I quote her, the oil in the wheels. It is our work in households that enables others to go out and be economically active. It is us who take care of your precious children and your sick and elderly. We cook your food to keep you healthy, and we look after your property when you are away. For employers, paying for household work is a form of outwork, insofar as a woman or family puts out its family labor to another. But it's more accurate to speak of the employment of domestic workers as insourcing, because the employer brings the worker into the home. This has become an arena for struggle over occupational health and safety due to the legacy of exclusion, a holdover from slavery and Jim Crow, of domestic workers being excluded from labor standards. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the care work economy hard, especially those who went into other people's homes as cleaners, nannies, and personal attendants. They were told not to come back or to come and stay, leaving their own households for the duration. They risked exposure to illness without personal protective equipment, and they labored outside the law, hidden in the household, often less organized than other workers. And so this other image here is from the early campaign by Domestic Workers United, which is one of the spearheads of what is now the National Domestic Workers Association. And it asked the question, how do you benefit from my labor? Because one of the challenges, both with the insourcing of manufacturing and digital work into homes, and the insourcing of people to perform such labor that we associate with family labor, is not really fully considering such work as work. And so here I have images of the legacy of unfreedom, the notion of household workers in particular as not real workers, or work that expropriates, as the philosopher Nancy Fraser put it, the freedom of those whom it exploits, the taking of labor power by confiscating capacities and resources and conscripting them into capital circuits of self-expansion. This certainly was true with slavery and under Jim Crow, but also in the rise that we've seen of household work, particularly since the 1970s in the US, but household work never went away. But we have conflated the homemaker and the household worker, and this is a persistent fact with the cult of domesticity and the ideology of the home. Back in the 1970s, so what, 50 odd years ago, there was an attempt to put private household workers into the labor law, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And according to Richard Nixon, Secretary of Labor, the domestic service is in some aspect unique from other forms of employment, he argued. A householder who hires a maid typically has just so much budgeted for that purpose with no more available. She also has no opportunity to pass on any higher wage costs. It comes down to it, the housewife can substitute her labor and that of other family members for the domestic. Few employers in other fields can do so. So that was his rationale and Nixon's rationale for initially vetoing the congressional attempt to expand the Fair Labor Standards Act. It passed the next year. But in the process, some household workers were written out of the law, and those were those who we consider home attendants or home healthcare workers, because they were redefined as elder companions. So it's been a struggle for the last 50 years, and the exemption from elder companions only happened under the Obama administration, but it took many, many years for that also to come into force, not until 2013. Okay, so what I contend is that the home has haunted the formulation of global labor standards as well as US standards. It has stood as the space of family privacy, the realm of what we call social reproduction, the making of people, where women's responsibility for the quotient aspects of life and for life itself distinguished her from the male breadwinner. Paid domestic work is commodified labor, but its outputs are a mixture of intangibles and material products that forge or produce the home and its people. The results of labor power dissipate through the very nature of cooking and cleaning, or become congealed in the bodies that incorporate such offerings, such as caring. You know, a woman's work is never done. You do the housework and it gets messed up right away. Why bother sometimes to dust or clean? It's just going to get messed up in a minute. Conflated with unpaid family labors, associated with those from despised race, ethnic, caste, or religious groups, household labor seems unskilled, an extension of the feminine or female. It was easy to dismiss income generation occurring in homes by mothers as just pin money, not real work. So rather than a progress narrative, this is a tale of return with a twist. From outwork as an evil to be eradicated, to home-based labor and home workers as deserving decent work like all other laborers, at a time when the standard labor regime has unraveled, with the return to home workplaces under the gig economy intensified by the pandemic. The conditions of home-based labor have depended on the very inequalities between genders and geographies that made homework seem like the best of a set of bad deals for enabling people to combine earning and caring. A deal that exemplifies cultural studies critic Lauren Berlant's concept of cruel optimism. The pandemic has revealed the limits of the home as a place of employment, even as this arrangement gestures to a new world of work. But is it really a solution to childcare and elder care? And so this is an image of the difficulties of women who went into the home during the pandemic to combine everything. What we really need to listen to early generations who can claim my home is my workplace, to see that flexibility has meant a stretch out of the working day. Suzanne Moore wrote in The Guardian at the beginning of the pandemic that somehow inflexibility becomes sold as flexibility. It assumes the worker is always primed for contact. The remote worker, for some companies, becomes the ideal employer. They don't need a desk or expensive office space. They don't need a union. They're malleable and compliant at the same time, when we are all concerned with the job losses to come, and we've seen that with the tech industry in recent weeks. They may not be quite as productive, but they're doing enough to make many big companies think this is the future. But it's also the past. Scattered, if not isolated, outworkers, remote workers stand before their employers more alone than those gathered into the same workspace. The violence of work could bleed into domestic violence. The conditions of labor, ventilation, light, heat, workspace depended on the conditions of housing. And the worker in most cases had to pay what were fixed costs of production for the tools, power, and the very building. That is why some employers and contractors gave supplies and machines, whether for sewing or computing. Others have expected the worker to pay upfront or deducted for materials. Now, most home workers have perceived of their labor as flexible. Compared to the factory bell or office clock, it was, but they could not truly control when they would labor. The work was irregular, given to meet the employer's needs, not the rhythms of family life. Garment outwork reflected the seasons of the industry. Telework, as well as other manufacturing, depended on the timing of orders. Digital putting out, such as Amazon's Mechanical Turks, is a constant hustle to bid for jobs. As such, home workers resembled other wage-earning mothers whose working days stretched out between paid labor and family labor. But the home worker experienced all her work in the same space. Children meant interrupted labor. Wage labor in the home meant mother-in-law's house. Wage labor in the home has meant neglected family labor. A Mexican-American woman in the early 1930s who went to her mother-in-law's house to sew on a machine typically reported that she, quote, works very brokenly when babies are awake, and complained she had no leisure for housework. As a Rhode Island lace maker explained, women who tell they can pull many bands a day don't tell truth. Those who pull many must let their housework go. With housework her first priority, she began to pull after dinner, frequently works until late at night. Over 40 years later, Maria Mies, German ethnographer and feminist scholar, reported on the lace makers of Nasipur in 1980s India. Undertaken between morning and evening, cooking and resumed by oil lamps, their crocheting become naturalized, even as male merchants and middlemen came to control a vast putting out system. What seemed to be a pastime had become a necessity for poorer families. Meanwhile, in the US, in the late 80s, immigrant garment workers testified, as one Salvadorian in Los Angeles told, of their desire to save on childcare expenses. And that's what motivated her turning to homework, but it hadn't worked out. Journalists reported home typists who discovered it didn't take long between things began to unravel. The children were at her elbow every minute, demanding a tissue or a cookie, or fighting with each other. The phone would ring or someone would be at the door, and usually the day ended in a full-blown chaos. So this is the circumstances of sweatshops in the home. What we see is a progression over the course of the 20th century from homework, or industrial homework in particular, being defined by reformers and trade unions to an evil practice, to the coverage under the global labor standards of the International Labor Organization under a notion of decent work. Let's make the labor that's in the home, despite questions of privacy, like all other work. That is minimum wage, maximum hours, occupational health and safety, the limits on child labor would also apply to the home workplace, and also such things as parental and maternity leave. So in the early 20th century, there's really a campaign in the US to ban the labor. Organized labor feared the undercutting of wage hours and working conditions of factory workers. And so there were many campaigns to end sweated labor, as it was called. There was intra-class conflict, which stymied the attempts by factory or inside workers to join with home workers against their common enemy, the employer, who attempted to pay the two groups of workers less and against each other. Gender, ethnicity, family status, and skill divided workers from each other, impeding unionization. And this was a problem worldwide, particularly after work is, through new forms of globalization, move from places like New England to rural Pennsylvania, to the US South, to Puerto Rico, to Mexico, to the Philippines, to China. I often do a exercise with my undergraduate students for them to look at the labels where their clothing was made. And by the end, everyone's standing up because their clothing was made in China. During the period between World War I and World War II, there was allowing for an exemption of outworkers in various global labor conventions that were passed by the International Labor Organization, which is the only today UN group that brings employers and workers and government officials together. It was still seen as an evil practice, and the home is a private space. After World War II, there was a lot of action against industrial homework in individual countries, but home handicraft was seen as fit work for women in Asia and other developing areas, as the image here shows. But over the course of the next decades, from the early 1960s to the 1990s, and really beginning in the 1980s, there were international trade unions and these committees on textiles and clothing and shoes that were assembled at the ILO that had workers, employers, and government representatives, began investigations and actions. At the same time, feminist development experts and women campaigners, part of a new global feminism after the UN conferences on women in the 1970s, and women activists in trade unions pushed for decent work for industrial home workers. So the idea was not to ban the practice, but to make it like other work. But of course, that would undermine the reason that employers sent work in the home, because it was cheaper. However, today we have a return of the sweatshop, not only globally, but with the gig economy and digital homework. And we perhaps could talk more about that later. There's a parallel movement then for manufacturing in the home, and that's domestic work. And here we have a trajectory from invisibility to recognition as work. The home location made it seem as intimate labor in private spaces, and that's outside of public interference. There was a long exclusion from national laws, the US as a particularly racialized case. And here in the early post-war 2 years, there was a belief that this was a vanishing occupation, that both industrial homework and domestic work were relics of the past, and somehow modernization and development would end such practices. But that wasn't the case. When experts met in the early 1950s on women's work in Geneva, they said, well, we need to lighten the household tasks of women workers so they won't hire domestic workers. To just speed up what I'm talking about, there was an assumption that everyone would do their own domestic labors, with governments providing social supports to relieve women workers with family responsibilities, as it was called. However, with the rise of labor force participation in the 1970s of mothers with children in this country, and with growing inequalities globally, a new generation of domestic workers came, and these were migrant domestic workers. Black women who had been US-born Black women who had been the predominant group of domestic workers in the South and with the Great Migration otherwise, had new opportunities, some of them, with the civil rights movement. But changes in immigration laws after 1965 put a new pool of workers, just as there was this crisis of care, of what I call a crisis of social reproduction. But this crisis generated reactions. But before I talk about that, let me just remind you that the transformation of household labor still had that legacy of a labor law that excluded these workers as real workers. As I said, the New Deal said the home was not a work site, that while some domestic workers came under Social Security in 1951, most did not. They didn't work enough hours for the same employer. In 1974, finally, household workers came under the Fair Labor Standards Act, but as I explained before, some were redefined outside of the law. And these classifications in the United States vary tremendously by states. California had wage boards from the early 20th century that did include some domestic workers. But there's always been the problem of enforcement. There's never been enough wage and hour or Department of Industrial Relations people to look at the home workplace. So what did that mean? That meant that you needed other groups to report violations of the law. And as I said, there was a change in 2013 under Obama that home health care workers could be included in the wage and hour law. So we don't get global labor standards until there is a push by workers' organizations. And the breakthrough, the home as a workplace, was in 1996, with the Homework Convention. So that was the industrial homework. And that paved the way for the domestic workers to win their own convention in 2011. And this was begun, the struggle, many decades before. In the first attempt was in the late 1940s. And today, these questions of industrial homework have re-emerged because of the gig economy. Behind these victories of having rules for and recognition of homes as workplace has been new domestic worker associations in the 2000s in the US and also abroad, led by what became in, I believe, 2007, the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Today, it has 60 affiliates in 36 cities and 17 states, covering 30,000 workers. Though not technically a union, it has become an affiliate of the AFL-CIO. By 2019, there were campaigns for domestic worker bills of rights that won wage, hour, break, contract, and other standards in 9 states and a few cities, Seattle, Philadelphia, and most recently, DC. The national campaign has been, there is a national law in the Congress. Jayapal from Seattle, and originally Kamala Harris put in for a federal law, and there is a national campaign for paid sick leave, civil rights protection, written contracts, guaranteed meal breaks, overtime pay, safety and health, standards boards, training, affordable health care and retirement benefits, and protections against harassment. But the big key is how do you enforce labor standards in the home? And there it means the vigor of these local organizations, of their allies in the labor movement, in NGOs, and the education of employers themselves, which the National Domestic Worker Alliance helped create their own employer organization, Hand in Hand, which was founded more than a decade ago to have a partner for bargaining and for negotiations and for lobbying. This is a nonprofit with a small staff, which seeks to create caring communities that recognize all of our interdependence and to give guidance to employers of how do you do a fair home, which involves fair pay, clear expectations, and paid time off. Which brings me to the latest campaigns, which is what I'm going to end with. As many of you might know, OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, replicated the exclusions of the original Fair Labor Standards Act. And Cal OSHA did the same. That is, it does not apply to individuals who, and this is quote, in their who privately employ persons for the purpose of performing what are commonly regarded as ordinary domestic household tasks in their own residences, I should add, such as house cleaning, cooking, and caring for children. Now, the fires and the pandemic spurred on a worker-led coalition to try to change this, put in by Maria Elena Durazo, a state representative from Los Angeles, an immigrant rights advocate and a former leader of the Los Angeles Federation of Labor. In 2020, with 50 co-sponsors, there was an act, Health and Safety for All Workers. It came out of the realization, as the testimonial of Sirocco, a worker leader at the Grafton Day Laborer Center, put it, of the employers not giving protective equipment, getting skin and eyes burns, having breathing problems. Domestic workers demanded the Cal OSHA to be included in that, because occupational safety, as she put it, and health is not a luxury, it is a necessity and a right of all workers. So this was a challenge. Legislative analysts estimated that 13 million households could come under the law. Some 2 million had hired more than 300,000 domestic workers, and this would rise by 52% in only a few years. Governor Newsom vetoed the law at the last moment in September 2020. It overwhelmingly passed with no vocal opposition, but he did not mention costs. Instead, he claimed that it was unworkable to give extend all employer obligations to private homeowners and renters. He put employer inconvenience and privacy over worker rights. He suggested employers didn't have the expertise to comply, that they were too stupid to be able to do so. But we know that all employers require education under Cal OSHA, and one of Cal OSHA's biggest activities is educating employers. So workers held a die-in. This one was in LA. However, the bill went in again, became SB 321, and it passed, but only by amending it to make to create an advisory committee to create voluntary guidelines and recommendations. I had the privilege of serving on that committee as an employer of a house cleaner and Berkeley occupational health and safety staff led by Laura Stock, and UCLA actually gave important, crucial guidance to this effort. Now, the original bill had a stakeholders committee and called for taking the equitable Cal OSHA regulations that do exist and adapting them to the home, and had a whole long provision that would go through many stages of mediation, and no inspector would initially end up being in anyone's home. But that was vetoed. So, but SB 321, it is a first of its kind occupational safety and health guidelines for home workplaces. The recommendation, though, number one, is to remove the household domestic worker exclusion from the labor code. And that once that exclusion is removed, that the Department of Industrial Relations and Cal OSHA can enforce health and safety regulations in these sectors. And there are many, many implications here. It wouldn't happen overnight. There would have to be hearings of stakeholders and adaptations of the appropriate existing rules and regulations. But among these recommendations also included a financial assistance program for low-resourced employers. And that's particularly true for many people who hire home attendants. It's a recent study right before the pandemic by the Labor Center at UCLA showed that while cleaners, the employers of cleaners were better off Californians, many of the employers of nannies and home attendants were not. And they were actually just getting by. And there are other recommendations are about education and working with community-based organizations. And so that's the recognition that a government agency cannot enforce by itself the home workplace. Finally, there are a lot of discussion about protection of both the workers and their employers, that there should be no retaliation, and that what is good for the workers is also good for the people who live in the home. That it's a lot of the health and safety guidelines are really common sense when it comes to everything from the use of power tools and extension cords to ergonomics to airborne pathogens to a whole range of, and many of you who are in this field know what I'm talking about, and that this is really very much a key. So let me end with two final thoughts. Are we all becoming home workers? Is the standard labor contract between employers and employees unraveling? And have we all become independent contractors and own account workers who lack social protection? This is a selfish reason, while some of us who are in either salaried employees or professionals ought to think of ourselves as workers and care about what's happening. So the task ahead is, with my home as a workplace, more than ever, we must insist that home-based workers are indeed workers and part of the labor force, not merely mothers undermining the real workers who labor in shops, offices, and factories. We are left with the persistence of the home sweatshop, but also the promise of remote work. The old canard of the home as a private space breaks down when my home becomes a workplace, when you come into my home as a worker, not only for myself, but for those I employ therein. Thank you.
So much food for thought there, and some good questions in the chat, which I'll read in a second. I also must point out that Laura Stock is a member of our center and director of our community engagement program. So we are very proud that she has joined you in the statewide commission to deal with these issues and have more confidence in their deliberations, because both of you are involved. So I'll start with a question that's in the chat, and it's one of the reasons why safety regulation, other worker protections do not extend to home-based work. For example, domestic workers, that home environments were too variable to control or impossible, if not difficult to set standards. So
yeah, that's a very good question. And we know that homes vary immensely, even among people in the same demographic group. So what's the solution? Not to do away with standards, but education. And education of the worker as well as the employer. That is, I had the same person since I moved to California come in and clean my home. She knew what to do. She knew what to use in ways I didn't. Unfortunately, she's moved, so I have a woman who has her own business come in. But she brings the best supplies. Now, we've talked about, I want ecologically good products. You have to be educated. And that's to everybody's benefit. So that's why one of the recommendations is to take what's called the DWOP program on domestic worker education project and extend it to occupational health and safety. It's a Department of Industrial Relations program that is going to be up for renewal soon. But to one of the next steps is really this education on occupational health and safety, and not just on ending wage theft or wage and hours. And it covers not only the home workplace per se, but such things as group care homes and such that are closely related. Because the workers, we learned when I did my study, Caring for America, the book I did on home health care, giving it a history with Jen Klein of Yale, we learned that the same workers circulate between the nursing home and private household work, between working with an IHSS in-home supportive service, government-funded program, and a private program, or working for a private agency, which would be a third-party employer sometimes. So it's really, that's what I would say. And that involves, by the way, the own language, making sure if a work, I mean, we heard horrendous stories about workers who couldn't read, who ended up putting bleach on a baby because they thought they were using something else and burning the skin. I mean, because they couldn't read in English, they could read in Spanish or some other language. So it's really important that contracts, that there's a walkthrough in the home, that potential problems are pointed out, are discovered. Because people live in the home workplace, and we would hope that they would care about their own health and safety.
We have a few more questions, so I will read. One is a comment that precedes a question. Little recognized fact is that remote working has resulted in workers carrying the company's real estate costs, including utilities, house payments, and work supplies. This is exaggerated by companies reducing their real estate footprints and associated costs. Can you comment on the role this plays in the increasing unfairness of this form of work, especially for families?
Yeah, well, what's new in California with the housing crisis? You know, your home workplace can only be as good as your home. So that's the first thing. Your employer, so when we had to go to remote teaching, UCSB didn't pay extra for my home office or my husband's home office. Right. You know, I'm now, and the way in which the federal tax code has been changed is very hard to deduct your home office. You used to be able to, but you have to be in a certain strata to even be able to think about doing that. And this is a long, that's one of the advantages of home-based labor. You know, the employer rarely, now there have been some good employers, but they really pay for the tools, or they charge you for the tools. That's what used to happen in the garment trade. Yeah. So this is really very apropos, and it would be a great research project for anyone out there. If there's any graduate students or researchers who can write grants in this area, who are in urban ecology, to really do a study of the real estate and the housing impact of the pandemic.
Well, what a great segue. We have a few more questions, but our center is having a pilot grants program. So if somebody takes up your cudgel, they should submit a proposal, and hopefully it would get funded after our peer review process. So the next question is, how do we progress in the era of small entrepreneurial work, such as Etsy, Uber, DoorDash, and homemakers who work restlessly and continue to get their rights neglected?
Yeah. Well, it's we have to be politically smarter. I mean, the proposition that attempted to strike down AB 5 was outrageous, and it confused so many voters. People talk about, oh, this gives me flexibility. I only need to earn a little bit more. But it has any, my son drove Lyft for a while when he first moved back to California. He didn't make any money. He did it to learn LA, and he, did it to take down stories of people he met. But he couldn't make a living on it, and you pay for your car. So this is a real problem. And it involves a political solution. That is that our state legislature, which is better than most, but also nationally, we have to have more funds into the enforcement of wage and hours and occupational health and safety, and more education. But we also, people need to collectively work together. And if that means unionization, if that means worker centers and associations, that is crucial, because individuals are not equal. That's what, that was the myth of the so-called Lochner era and the of the 14th Amendment interpretation, which today's Supreme Court wants to bring back through Samuel Alito, that, it's a freedom of contract, but the individual does not have the resources of the corporation and of the company.
Great. So there's a question in the chat. I hope we can keep it for all time, but so it is, how do you see workers' compensation playing into the home works situation? For domestic worker, there are people living in the home who technically supervise. With the pandemic and people working from home, there is no direct supervision by the employer.
Yeah, that's a real tough one. Look, if you're a homeowner, or even a renter, you should have insurance. And this is one of the things that I think we really have to think creatively about. And yeah, I'm not an expert in workers' compensation. One's homeowner insurance or renter's insurance should afford some coverage. If somebody breaks their leg in your home, then they should be covered. Now, what about you as a worker in your own home? That's the rub. And so far, the law doesn't cover that. But what if you get carpal tunnel syndrome because your employer forces you to work at home and doesn't provide the correct ergonomics? There, I think you'd come under workers' compensation, but I'm sure there are some people who are more experts.
Well, I mean, one comment on that is that a lot of the people who work in the home are not formally employed,
Right.
so that they don't get the workplace protections that were developed in the 20th century. And that may be one of the reasons why the gig economy has emerged, because the cost that's on the workers rather than on the company. So
that's a really important point, because it's a way to reclassify workers so they are not under the formal labor standards. That's why we get, nurses made into supervisors because foremen are not included. People made into independent contractors. That goes way, way back. And informality is a way to avoid labor standards. And the whole movement of domestic workers is asking for, and earlier home-based workers, for formal recognition.
So couple more issues. Is there any chance that the fact that white-collar workers for the first time were involved in homework, that might provide some leverage to help the legislature in Sacramento and the Congress in Washington, at least half of it, to put in place some changes that protect home workers?
Yeah.
Do
Well,
we provide some leverage?
Yeah, there's two things there. Yes, and maybe. That is, most white collar workers think of themselves as professionals rather than workers. And our association of workers is with the blue collar or the no collar or the pink collar worker. So we see this with a lot of people doing immaterial labor. The reaction of some people to academic workers going on strike, for example, wait a minute, they're not workers, they're students or they're professors. So, but we can understand the strikes of maintenance men, right? So that is also an ideological and an educational. But where is the movement in the movement right now? We're seeing museums, tech companies, journalism, media, etc. That's where a lot of organizing is going. And I think as people experience their own forms of being exploited in some ways, of hassle, we might not call it exploitation, we might be calling, I'm working all the time. There may be a change of consciousness, but the maybe comes from there's such variety of experiences. So there are sectors within what we think of as the white collar workforce, and some are poorly compensated. I'll use my son again. He's a contract worker for LA Public Health doing COVID. He probably will get laid off at the end of March because of the end of the, he may not be, but he's working through a contractor. He didn't get a pay raise after a year or anything when the regular workers got it. He's cheaper. He's disposable. He works remotely from home. That's very different than my work when I work remotely from home.
I think that the fact that many of our
He has an MPH. Anyone looking to hire an MPH in the LA area?
I think the fact that many of the people on this call's children or grandchildren are in that boat represents a form of downward mobility that none of us hope to see. I want to make one point and closing before we thank Professor Boris for her just excellent talk. Hers really fits in nicely with the last two talks from the series we've been doing on the working conditions across colors or no collar color, because Carissa last month from our center and director of the Northern California Center for Occupational Environment and Health, Carissa Harris-Adamson, spoke on the ergonomic issues that face home workers. And before that, Annie McClanahan from UC Irvine gave a very important talk, as I mentioned at the outset of this hour, on the rhetoric that underlies the attempt to shift risks away from the companies and to workers. And so the notion that you're gain some freedom, we also know that you're free to fall through a lot of cracks. And so with that in closing, this series, a really great appreciation for a wonderful talk on the history of homework and its evolution, and how unfortunately the realities that we're apparent to many after the passage of the Social Security Act and the Labor Standards Acts, that who was left out continued today. Just to close, this talk, like all the prior ones from the series, will be available on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And we welcome you back next month, as I mentioned at the outset, to begin our next series on making healthy work with Gorian Sorensen from Harvard University. So thank you, Eileen, and thank you, audience, for very active participation in the chat and also in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for having me.